The reduction clock on the far wall read 6 hours, 11 minutes, and it did not stop moving while Casen Ward worked, which was the entire point of putting it there. He had learned not to look at it. Looking at it did nothing but make the crate in front of him heavier. Instead, he kept his gloved hands moving, lifting brittle sheets one at a time from the packing case marked First Cycle and when original queued, laying each page flat under the scanner bar, watching the green light crawl across 600 years of somebody else's handwriting before the machine chimed, and he moved to the next. Around him, the reduction bay hummed with 40 other cadets doing the same thing at 40 other stations, the sound of it less like a library and more like an assembly line, because that was what it was. Digitize, catalog, reduce. Nothing physical stayed on Ledger's reach forever. The moon didn't have the volume for forever, no matter how badly the Cordant Imperium wanted to remember everything it had ever done. Ledger's reach held, by the Central Registry's own last public accounting, some 11 billion catalogued physical items across 400 storage rings, a figure so large that nobody who worked here bothered repeating it, because there was no useful way to hold a number that size in your head while also holding a scanner wand steady. What mattered on the floor was smaller and more immediate: 40 stations to a shift, 6 shifts to a cycle, and a reduction schedule that never once in 600 years had been permitted to fall behind. Casen was 19 years old and had been assigned to the reduction bay for 11 months, which made him one of the more senior tribute cadets on this floor, a distinction that came with exactly no privileges. He still wore the same gray coveralls as everyone else shipped up from Earth to work off the compact det one digitized page at a time. He still ate in the same low-ceilinged mess. He still slept in the same stacked berths 4 levels down, where the artificial gravity was tuned a fraction weaker than regulation, because nobody had gotten around to fixing it, and probably never would. What he had that most of the other cadets didn't was a habit his supervisor called thoroughness and Casen privately thought of as something closer to an itch. He read things. Not skimmed, read. Every manifest tag, every routing stamp, every marginal note some clerk had scrawled 4 centuries ago and never expected another living eye to see. It slowed him down. His quota numbers were middling because of it. But it was also why, 40 minutes before the reduction clock would have taken the box away from him forever, he noticed that the case in front of him was lying to him. The tag said when original queued, a duplicate, a copy of something already preserved elsewhere, safe to melt down for vault space because the record existed somewhere else in a form that mattered more. But the binding under his hands wasn't a duplicate's binding. Duplicates were printed on stabilized modern stock, uniform and characterless, made to look old without costing anything to make. This was real vellum, cracked at the spine where 6 centuries of humidity cycling had worked at it, the ink gone the particular brown-black that only happened when iron gall ink aged past the point of chemistry caring what color it had started as. He had scanned enough genuine first cycle originals to know the difference in his hands before his mind caught up with what his hands were telling him. He turned it over. Stamped into the leather cover, worn nearly smooth, was a title he had known since before he could read Cordant script fluently, because every tribute cadet learned it in orientation in the first week, as a lesson about what happened to worlds that said no. Survey Log, KEST Hollow Campaign, Fleet Marshal ORSIN KADE, commanding. Casen's hands went still on the desk. Everyone on Ledger's reach knew the Kest Hollow Campaign. Everyone in the Imperium knew it, human and Ashkarai and every other tribute species down the long list of worlds that answered to the Cordant throne. It was the founding parable, 600 years old and still taught in every orientation lecture on every occupied world. Kest Hollow had refused the Imperium's terms. Fleet Marshal Cade's ships had arrived to enforce them, and when the fleet made planetfall, they had found the world already empty. Its people, rather than kneel, had chosen what history called the Cinder Vow, Some final act of collective destruction that left nothing behind but ash fields and silence. No survivors. No negotiation. No claimants left alive to contest what came next, which was that Kest Hollow's territory and assets passed, by right of abandonment, directly into Imperial hands. That single finding, a world found empty, its people having chosen annihilation over submission, had become law. The Cinder Doctrine. 600 years of continuity court rulings rested on it. Any world that could be shown to have abandoned itself rather than accept imperial terms forfeited everything. No treaty required, no negotiation owed, because there was no one left to negotiate with. It was the founding legal fact of half the Imperium's expansion, cited so often that most people who invoked it had never seen the original report. They cited the transcription. Everyone cited the transcription. The transcription was the only version most archivists on Ledger's Reach had ever laid eyes on. A clean, canonical, 300-page rendering prepared 4 decades ago by a young and ambitious scholar named Aldous Vren. The same Aldous Vren who now ran the entire Central Registry as Chief Registrar, and whose name Casen had seen stamped at the top of half the citation logs he'd scanned this year. This was the original. The actual physical report, 600 years old, and someone had mislabeled it a duplicate to get it into the reduction queue. Casen looked at the clock. 5 hours, 26 minutes. Protocol was simple and he had it memorized from his first week. Any material discovered to be miscatalogued got flagged, the crate got pulled, and the anomaly went up the chain to the supervising registrar's desk. He reached for the flag key on his console and then stopped, his hand hovering, because something about pulling it made his stomach tighten in a way he couldn't yet explain to himself. The flag would go to Registrar and Second Halden Reyes first, as it should, since Reyes ran this floor. But anomalies involving first cycle material, the oldest, rarest tier, routed automatically to the Chief Registrar's office as a matter of standing policy. To Vren's desk. The same Vren, whose 40-year-old transcription was the only version of this report anyone had ever been permitted to read. He told himself that was exactly why he should flag it. A discrepancy this old deserved the Chief Registrar's attention precisely because it mattered. He also, before he did anything else, turned to the back of the report and kept reading, because that itch never once in his life had let him stop at the interesting part. The last 40 pages were Cade's own hand, dense and confident, the prose of a man who had never once doubted the value of his own conclusions. Casen scanned through them fast, matching what he read against the version he half remembered from orientation. The arrival, the silence on approach, the landing parties finding the settlements empty, the ash fields, the final judgment that the population had destroyed itself rather than submit. It matched. Word for word in places, matched the transcription he'd been taught to recite. Then the vellum changed. It was subtle at first. A different hand, tighter and more careful, the ink a shade lighter, as though whoever had written it had less confidence in the paper's patience. 4 pages, stitched into the binding at the rear rather than sewn through with the rest of the gathering, the way something got added after the fact rather than composed as part of the whole. A header at the top of the first page, in that tighter hand. Addendum filed by Submarshal Ilwythren, Second Officer, Survey Vessel Reckoning, not entered into standing record. Casen read it twice before he let himself believe the second reading matched the first. Submarshal Wren had not agreed with Fleet Marshal Cade's account. Wren's addendum stated, in plain, unhedged language, that long-range scans taken 11 days before planetfall had already shown Kest Hollow's settlements powering down in sequence, consistent with a coordinated evacuation rather than a static population awaiting judgment. That the ash fields Cade's report described as evidence of self-immolation matched, in composition and distribution, the signature of orbital bombardment ordnance, the Reckoning's own ordnance, rather than any groundside detonation. That Wren had raised this discrepancy with Cade directly before the official report was filed, and had been overruled, and had filed this addendum as the only recourse available to a second officer, who could not stop a fleet marshal from writing history the way he preferred it written. The addendum ended there. No signature beneath it but Wren's own. No notation that it had ever been read by anyone else, filed anywhere else, entered into any record that mattered. Casen sat very still in the noise of the reduction bay, 40 other scanners chiming around him, and understood with a kind of cold, falling clarity that if Submarshal Wren had been right, then Kest Hollow had not chosen the Cinder vow at all. Kest Hollow had tried to leave, and Fleet Marshal Orson Cade had bombarded an evacuating population from orbit, called the wreckage a suicide, and built the Imperium's oldest law on the lie. 5 hours 9 minutes. He did not flag it. He told himself, in the 2 seconds it took to make the decision, that flagging it now, sending word straight up the chain to the man whose entire scholarly reputation was built on the version of this document that didn't contain page after page contradicting it, was not the same thing as protecting the record. He didn't know yet what it was instead, but his hands were already moving, pulling the loose scanner wand off its cradle, angling it low and careful over the addendum's 4 pages, running a private capture onto his own credentialed slate under the perfectly legal pretext of double-checking a difficult scan, which cadets did constantly, which raised no alarms, which left a completely unremarkable entry in the digitization log that any auditor glancing at it would read as nothing at all. 4 pages, 90 seconds, done. Then, because not flagging a first cycle anomaly at all was its own violation, one that would show up the moment anyone cross-checked the crate's manifest against what he'd actually scanned, he filed the standard discrepancy report exactly as protocol required: material mismatch to its catalog tag, recommend manual review before reduction, and sent it up the chain the ordinary way, through Rays, the way it was supposed to go. He told himself this was thoroughness. He told himself this was just doing his job correctly. He did not let himself examine too closely why his pulse hadn't slowed down since he'd read the header on that 4th page. The flag pulled the crate's clock into a manual hold, which was the closest he had to relief. No automatic reduction until someone with authority reviewed the discrepancy and cleared it. He watched the counter on the crate's tag flicker, reset, then settle into a new state. Hold pending review. Not gone. Not safe. Just paused for however long paperwork took to move through a bureaucracy 600 years old and in no particular hurry about anything. Registrar and Second Halden Rays found him 20 minutes later, when the shift bell rang and the bay began to empty, cadets peeling off gloves and filing toward the lifts. Rays was 61 years old, human, with the particular stooped patience of a man who had spent 2 decades on Ledger's Reach and had stopped, a long time ago, expecting any of it to get easier. He read the discrepancy flag off his own console with his glasses pushed up onto his forehead, squinting at the crate number, and something in his face changed when he saw the title attached to it. Kest Hollow, he said, not quite a question. Original, Casen said, not a duplicate. The binding's wrong for a duplicate, the ink's wrong, everything about it is wrong for a duplicate. You read the whole thing. Enough of it. Rays looked at him for a long moment, and Casen watched the older man decide something, weigh it, and then set it down without saying it out loud. Leave the flag as filed, Rays said finally. Don't add anything to it. Don't talk about it on the floor. It'll route to the Chief Registrar's office same as any first cycle discrepancy. He'll clear it or he won't, and either way it stops being your problem the second it leaves your queue. Why would it not clear? I didn't say that. Rays's voice had gone careful in a way Casen hadn't heard from him before, not in 11 months. I said it stops being your problem. That's a kindness, Ward, take it. Casen almost let it go. He was tired, and the shift bell had already rung twice, and Rays had never once in 11 months given him advice that turned out wrong. but there was something in the way the older man had said the Chief Registrar's title, not with the flat neutrality everyone used for a superior 3 tiers removed, but with something closer to caution, the specific caution of a man who had learned a lesson once and never forgot the shape of it. "Has this happened before?" Casen asked. "Someone finding something in a first cycle crate that didn't match?" Reyes was quiet long enough that Casen thought he wasn't going to answer at all. "There was a cadet 8 years before you came up," Reyes said finally. "Good with the old manifests, sharper eyes than most. She flagged a discrepancy in a first cycle box much like you did today, and the Chief Registrar's office cleared it inside a day. Very fast. Faster than first cycle reviews usually go." He picked his glasses back off his forehead and settled them onto his nose, a small, deliberate motion that Casen understood was meant to end the conversation. "She was reassigned to a mining tribute posting 11 days later. I don't know what she found. I never asked. I'm telling you this once and then we're not discussing it on the floor again. Go eat something. You look like you haven't in a while." He left. Casen stood by his console a moment longer, looking at the crate's status tag, hold, pending review, and then at the private slate in his coverall pocket, where 4 scanned pages of a 600-year-old lie sat waiting for him to decide what they were worth. He didn't go straight to the mess. He went to the transit rail instead, rode it 2 stops past his own dormitory block to the Tribute Labor Comms terminal on Ring 4, and used 10 of his allotted monthly minutes to send a message home, because it was 10th day, and on 10th days his mother's shift ended early enough that she might actually be near a terminal to answer. She was, her face resolved on the small screen looking older than it had any right to at 44, the particular tiredness of a continuity debt laborer who'd been on double shifts since the quota increase 18 months ago. Ellen Ward smiled when she saw him anyway, the same smile she'd had his whole life, worn thin at the edges but real underneath it. "You look thin," she said, before he'd said anything at all. "I'm fine." Work's fine. It wasn't a lie exactly. He wasn't going to tell her about the addendum on a monitored tribute line with 90 seconds left on the connection. "How's the debt schedule?" Her smile didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. "Same as it's been. Compact renews next generation cycle, same as it always has. Nothing's changed." "Right," Casen said, "nothing's changed." He'd asked her, years ago, back when he was young enough to ask things without understanding what the answers cost, why Earth owed the compact debt at all, what Earth had done, what treaty Earth had broken, to end up bound into tribute service generation after generation. She told him what everyone was told, that a human deep space settlement called Pharaoh's Landing, one of Earth's earliest attempts at colonization beyond the solar system, had been found abandoned during a first contact skirmish 40 years ago. Its people vanished, its territory and infrastructure forfeit under the Imperium's oldest annexation law, the same law that made an abandoned world's parent civilization liable for the debt of its lost colony under something called continuity of claim. Earth, having birthed Pharaoh's Landing, inherited Pharaoh's Landing's forfeiture. That was the whole of it. That was why his mother worked double shifts on a debt she hadn't personally incurred, why he'd shipped off to a moon 400 light-years from home at 17 to work it down a page at a time, why an entire planet had spent 40 years paying for a colony nobody living had ever seen. The oldest annexation, law in the Imperium. The connection cut at the 90-second mark, the way it always did, his mother's face freezing mid-sentence and then dissolving to gray. Casen sat at the terminal a long moment, the comms hall around him mostly empty at this hour, and thought about the phrase he'd read 4 times now in Submarshal Wren's careful hand, not entered into standing record, and about a law that let an empire annex anything it wanted from a world it had already decided couldn't fight back, so long as it could produce one report saying nobody was left alive to disagree. He went back to his slate and started reading everything the public archive terminals would let him access about the Cinder Doctrine's legal architecture. He was careful about it, spreading the queries across 2 days, mixing them in with ordinary study material a cadet might reasonably look up, never touching the addendum's actual scan pages on any terminal that logged activity. It took him most of 2 nights to trace the whole chain, working from his berth after lights down with the slate's brightness turned to nothing, and by the end of it, his hands weren't quite steady anymore. The Cinder Doctrine established that a world found abandoned rather than negotiated with forfeited its territory and assets outright. No treaty, no compensation, no surviving claimant to contest it. 411 separate annexations across 6 centuries cited it as controlling precedent, according to the Continuity Court's own public index, though the actual number was almost certainly higher, since not every annexation bothered filing a formal citation for something so thoroughly settled. And nested inside the doctrine, applied 190 years after Kest Hollow to formalize exactly this kind of case, was the continuity of claim clause. When an abandoned colony's origin world could be identified, that origin world inherited liability for whatever debts, treaty violations, or unresolved claims attached to the abandoned territory. It had been written, according to the commentary, to prevent parent civilizations from founding reckless colonies and walking away from the consequences. It had been used 40 years ago against Earth. Casen sat in the dark of his berth with the slate held close to his chest, so the light wouldn't wake the cadet in the bunk below him, and understood that the entire architecture of his mother's exhaustion, his own 11 months in a reduction bay 400 light-years from home, the whole shape of his life since he was 17 years old, traced back through 190 years of legal scaffolding to 4 pages, a dead man had stitched into the back of a report because he couldn't stop his commanding officer from lying, and nobody with the power to matter had ever read them. He thought about Ray's face when he'd said she was reassigned 11 days later. He kept reading anyway. The discrepancy flag sat in hold pending review for 6 days, which Ray's told him without being asked was unusually long for a first-cycle anomaly and unusually short for anything requiring genuine investigation. The kind of interval that meant someone had looked at it just long enough to decide how to handle it, and no longer. On the 7th day, Casen's console lit up with a new routing notice. The crate had been recatalogued, not cleared as an error, not confirmed as an anomaly requiring escalation, but quietly reclassified from first cycle queued, hold to second cycle, confirmed duplicate reduction authorized, a designation that stripped it of every protection first cycle status carried and dropped it straight back into the ordinary destruction schedule. New reduction window, 4 days out. Signed off, according to the routing header, by Chief Registrar Aldous Vren personally, which first cycle discrepancies of any real weight always were, and which meant nothing on its face except that the man whose life's work rested on the version of this document, without Submarshal Wren's addendum in it, had looked at the discrepancy Casen flagged and quietly ruled that it wasn't one. Casen stared at the reclassification for a long time before he understood what had actually happened. Vren hadn't ignored the flag. He'd read it carefully enough to know exactly which crate to reclassify, exactly which line in the manifest to alter to make the problem disappear back into a queue where nobody would look twice at it again. That wasn't the behavior of an overworked administrator clearing a backlog. That was the behavior of a man who already knew what was in that binding, long before a 19-year-old cadet's discrepancy flag ever reached his desk. He went looking for evidence of that, because by now the itch had stopped being curiosity and started being something with teeth in it. The Central Registry's audit logs went back further than most cadets ever bothered checking. Every reclassification, every reduction authorization, every signature stamped against a first cycle item, archived in a running record that existed, in theory, so the registry could account for its own decisions if the continuity court ever asked. Casen searched it the way he searched everything, slowly, thoroughly, cross-referencing crate identifiers across the decades until his eyes ached from the terminal glow. It took him 4 nights. On the 4th night he found it. 14 years earlier, during what the log described as a routine founding-era inventory audit, a first-cycle crate matching the Kest Hollow Survey storage identifier had been pulled, examined, and personally reclassified by a junior registrar named Aldous Vren 11 years before he became Chief Registrar, back when he was still building the reputation that would eventually get him the office. The reclassification notation was 4 words long: duplicate confirmed, no addendum, no addendum. As though someone who'd never opened past page 160 could possibly know there was nothing stitched into the back of it. Casen sat back from the terminal in the dark of the empty study carrel he'd claimed for the night and felt something in his chest go very cold and very still. Vren had found it 14 years ago. Not this year, not when Casen's flag crossed his desk. 14 years ago, as a junior registrar with no reason yet to protect a transcription that didn't exist yet, because the Vren transcription wasn't published until 11 years before that, meaning the man now running the entire central registry had known about Submarshal Wren's addendum for at least 25 years, had built his career's defining scholarly work on the version of the report that erased it, and had spent every year since making sure the original stayed exactly where it was, mislabeled, buried, one clerical error away from being melted down for good. This wasn't oversight. It had never been oversight. He didn't tell Reyes right away. It took him another day to decide he had to, mostly because the alternative, carrying this alone toward a 4-day reduction window with no plan and no ally who understood the registry's internal machinery better than he did, was not a plan at all, just a slower way of losing. He found Reyes at the end of a shift, in the narrow equipment room off the reduction bay, where the older man sometimes lingered after hours doing paperwork nobody else wanted, and laid the audit log entry down on the desk between them without a word. Reyes read it twice. His face didn't change much, which Casen had come to understand meant he was more afraid, not less. "You went into the 14-year archive," Reyes said quietly. "That's not ordinary cadet activity, Ward. Someone in records security is going to notice a search pattern like that eventually, if they haven't already." He knew, Casen said. 14 years at minimum, maybe longer. He's not protecting an old mistake, he's protecting a lie he's been sitting on since before he ran anything. "I know what it means." Reyes pushed the slate away from himself, not roughly, but with the particular care of a man handling something he'd rather not have touched at all. "I told you once already what happened to the last cadet who found something like this. You told me she got reassigned. You didn't tell me what she found." "Because I don't know," Reyes said, and for the first time in 11 months Casen heard real anger under the older man's voice, though it wasn't aimed at him. "That's the point, Ward. Nobody knows because whatever it was, it disappeared with her, and the only thing left behind was every other cadet on this floor learning not to ask. That's how this works. That's how it's worked for longer than either of us has been alive. You don't win against an institution by being right. You win, if you win at all, by making being right cost the institution more than silencing you does. And right now what you're holding costs you everything and costs him nothing, because it's sitting on a slate in your pocket and a reduction crate with a 4-day clock on it, and neither of those things means anything to a continuity court unless somebody with standing puts them in front of a judge." Casen was quiet for a moment. "Is there a way to do that? Put it in front of a judge?" Reyes looked at him for a long time, and something in the set of his shoulders shifted. Not agreement exactly, but the specific resignation of a man deciding he was already too far into something to pretend otherwise. "There's a procedure," he said finally. buried deep enough in registry law that I doubt 6 people on this station remember it exists. It's called a continuity hold. Any registered archive worker who has personally handled a piece of material under active reduction review can file one, a formal challenge asserting the material has historical or legal significance beyond its catalog classification. It stops reduction cold, no exceptions, pending a mandatory continuity court hearing. It's meant for exactly this, a safeguard against a registrar office making a unilateral call on something that matters too much for one desk to decide alone. Then why doesn't anyone use it? Because filing one puts your name on permanent record as the person who challenged a chief registrar's classification decision, and there is no version of that which doesn't end your career here, and likely a great deal more than your career, if the chief registrar in question has spent 25 years protecting something worth protecting. Reyes rubbed a hand across his face. It's a door nobody opens because everyone who might need to already knows what's on the other side of it. Would it work? It would force a hearing. Whether it works depends on what you can put in front of the court when you get there, and on timing. Reyes' expression sharpened. Do you know what's on the continuity court's docket in 9 days? Casen didn't and said so. Earth's compact renewal session. Comes up once a generational cycle, mostly ceremonial. The court confirms the existing tribute terms stand for another cycle. Everyone signs. Everyone goes home. But it's the one moment in 20-some years where Earth's entire continuity of claim liability is formally, publicly on the court's table for review, with observers from every tribute world watching the broadcast feed, because compact renewals set precedent other worlds cite for their own. He tapped the slate. If you file a continuity hold on this crate before that session closes, and if you can get what's in it entered as evidence tied to that hearing, it doesn't just become an isolated challenge to one old report. It becomes part of the permanent record of the case that governs whether your own planet keeps paying a 600-year-old debt built on a lie. Miss that window, and the next chance is another generation away, by which point that crate will be ash, and you along with your career most likely, whatever's left of it. 9 days. A 4-day reduction window sitting inside it like a smaller, sharper clock ticking down inside a larger one. Then I file it, Casen said. Reyes didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had gone very quiet. If you do this, you do it knowing Vren is going to come at you the moment your name hits that filing, not after. He has spent 25 years making sure nobody ever gets this far. He is not going to let a tribute cadet be the exception because you followed procedure correctly. I know. You don't, Reyes said, not unkindly. Not yet, but you're going to. He was right within 2 days. The first sign was small, a routing notice informing Casen that his standing work assignment in the reduction bay was under review pending a conduct evaluation, language vague enough to mean anything and specific enough that Casen understood exactly what it meant. The second sign was less small. A registry security notice, posted to every terminal on the floor, announcing a routine inventory sweep of the reduction bays held and pending crates. Routine, the notice insisted, standard procedure, nothing to do with any individual cadet's conduct scheduled to begin in 6 hours. 6 hours. The Kest Hollow crate, reclassified back into the ordinary reduction schedule, currently sat exactly where it had always sat, in the holding rack 3 rows from Casen's station, waiting for its 4-day window to close in 2 days regardless of whatever the sweep found. If registry security found it sitting there ahead of schedule during an inventory pass, flagged, cross-referenced, connected to a cadet whose conduct was suddenly under review, there was no version of the next 12 hours that ended with Casen anywhere near it again. He didn't have the continuity hold filed yet. He hadn't even confirmed he had access to the terminal that processed one. Reyes had said the filing had to go through the continuity court's own registry desk, not the central registry's internal system, which meant physically reaching a terminal in the court's wing, 3 transit rings away, during a window when his movement was almost certainly already being watched. He found Reyes in the equipment room again, and this time it was Reyes who spoke first. "I heard about the sweep," the older man said, "and the conduct review, fast work even for him. I need to get the crate out of the bay before the sweep starts, and I need to reach the court registry desk with it before the reduction window closes, both, in under 2 days. Reyes was quiet for a moment, doing some private calculation Casen couldn't see the shape of. Then he stood, crossed to the equipment room supply locker, and pulled out a standard transport case, the kind used for moving fragile first-cycle material between wings, unremarkable, the sort of thing nobody looked at twice on a station where everyone was always moving something. "Give me the crate's location," Reyes said. "I'll pull it during the shift change when the floor's thinnest. I have supervisor clearance to move held material without triggering a flag. That's not against protocol, it's literally my job. Nobody will look twice at me carrying a transport case. They will look twice at you. They'll check the supervisor logs eventually." "Eventually isn't in the next 2 days," Reyes said. "Eventually is someone else's problem, and by the time it's a problem, either you'll have already filed with the court, or none of this will have mattered anyway." Casen looked at him, 61 years old, a career spent quietly outlasting a system he'd told Casen flatly that nobody won against, and understood with a kind of aching clarity exactly what Reyes was choosing to risk, and exactly why he hadn't been asked to. "You don't have to do this." "No," Reyes agreed. "I don't." He picked up the transport case. "Go, I'll have it moved within the hour. Meet me at the West Transit Junction at shift change. And Ward, after this, whatever happens, you did the reading. All of it. That's not nothing. That's the only reason any of this is happening at all." The sweep began on schedule, 6 hours after the notice posted, sweeping methodically through the reduction bays holding racks under the bland, unhurried authority of routine inventory. Casen worked his station through all of it with his hands steadier than he felt, scanning ordinary second-cycle duplicates, watching security officers move rack to rack with handheld scanners, cross-checking tags against manifest. They reached the rack where the Kest hollow crate should have been at the 11-minute mark. Casen didn't look up from his console. He heard, rather than saw, the small pause, a scanner beeping against an empty slot, a murmured exchange between 2 officers, a supervisor's terminal pinged for clarification. It took 40 minutes for the answer to come back down the chain. Crate relocated per Registrar and Second Reyes' authorization, standard transfer, logged and accounted for. The sweep moved on. Casen didn't breathe easy. He understood, watching the officers finish their pass and file out, that this had bought hours, not safety, that somewhere above him, a man who had spent 25 years making sure this exact document never surfaced was recalibrating, right now, how much longer he could afford to be patient. He was right to think so. He learned exactly how right 3 hours later, when he reached the West Transit Junction at shift change and found no sign of Halden Reyes at all, only a second registry security notice, freshly posted, informing the floor that Registrar and Second Reyes had been placed under formal detention pending an obstruction inquiry, effective immediately, for unauthorized relocation of restricted first-cycle material. Casen stood in the empty junction a long moment, the transit rail humming past on its track, and felt the floor of the last 2 days drop out from under him. Reyes was gone. The crate's location, wherever it had ended up before security caught up with him, was gone with it, or worse, already in security's custody, already back in Vren's hands, already an hour from a reduction chamber that didn't observe holds filed by cadets under conduct review. He had less than a day left on the window, no mentor, no crate as far as he knew, and a chief registrar who had just demonstrated with total institutional confidence exactly how fast he could make a problem disappear. Casen made himself breathe. Once slowly, the way Reyes had taught him to do at a scanner console when a difficult page threatened to unravel his patience. Then he started walking, not toward the dormitory block, not toward anywhere registry security would expect a conduct review cadet to go, but toward the one place he still had a legitimate reason to be at this hour. The reduction bay's supply corridor, where the transport cases were kept, where Halden Reyes had told him once, months ago, in an offhand comment about the station's layout that Casen hadn't understood the value of until this exact moment, that the service tunnels beneath the bay ran clean through to the court wing's lower levels. Unmonitored, built 2 centuries ago for maintenance access, and never decommissioned because nobody had ever thought to. He didn't know if the crate was still findable. He didn't know if Reyes had hidden it somewhere along that route before security caught him, or if it was already gone. He knew he had less than a day, and one place left to look. The service tunnels beneath the reduction bay were exactly as old and exactly as forgotten as Reyes had described, low-ceilinged, lit by strip lighting that had degraded to a sour amber over 2 centuries of neglect, air thick with the particular cold mineral smell of a moon's rock showing through where the station's climate systems didn't bother reaching. Casen had never been down here. Almost no one had. The maintenance logs Reyes mentioned in passing had shown routine access requests dwindling to nothing over the last 40 years, which meant the tunnels ran unmonitored not out of any careless oversight, but because nobody with authority had thought them worth the expense of watching. He moved through them fast, counting junctions the way Reyes had once sketched on a napkin without explaining why, until he reached a service alcove tucked behind a coolant relay housing, exactly where a man who'd spent 20 years learning every unglamorous inch of this station's infrastructure might choose to hide something he needed found again by exactly one person. The transport case sat wedged behind the housing, dust already settling on its lid. Casen's hands weren't steady when he opened it. The original survey log lay inside, undisturbed, 600 years of brittle vellum still intact, still real, still the only physical proof in the entire Cordant Imperium that Submarshal Illith Wren had told the truth, and nobody had ever let it matter. Tucked beside it, folded once, was a note in Reyes's economical handwriting, Court Wing Lower Access, Maintenance Junction 9. If you're reading this, I didn't make it back to you. File it yourself. You know how. HR. Casen read it twice, then folded it into his coverall pocket and kept moving. The tunnels ran another 40 minutes before the amber lighting gave way to the cleaner white of Court Wing infrastructure, the air changing temperature, the low hum of a functioning station replacing the coolant relay silence behind him. He found Maintenance Junction 9 exactly where the note promised, a service hatch set into the underside of the Court Wing's lower concourse, unlocked because nobody imagined a tribute cadet would ever find reason to use it. He came up into a service alcove off the concourse itself, transport case clutched against his chest, and nearly walked straight into a young Ashkarai clerk in registry uniform, crossing the same corridor with an armful of filing slates. She startled, dropped one slate, and looked at him, gray coveralls, dust-streaked, clearly not supposed to be emerging from a maintenance hatch in the Court Wing at this hour, with an expression that could have gone half a dozen directions, and, for one unbearably long second, Casen genuinely didn't know which one it would. "Your registry," she said finally, reading the tribute cadet insignia on his collar rather than raising an alarm. "Reduction Bay. I've seen your work logs cross my desk. You're the one who flagged the Kest Hollow discrepancy." Casen went very still. "You've seen the flag." "I process routing for first cycle escalations." "I saw it come in, and I saw it get reclassified 8 days later without ever reaching an actual review board, which isn't how first cycle escalations are supposed to work, and I've been trying not to think too hard about why for over a week now, because thinking too hard about it seemed like exactly the kind of thing that gets a person's assignment reviewed. She glanced past him at the hatch he'd climbed out of, then at the case in his arms, and something in her face settled into a decision. I'm Taylai's core. I'm not going to ask what's in that case, because I think I already know, and I think if I ask I'll be obligated to report it, and I don't especially want to be obligated to do that today. I need to reach the Continuity Court's registry desk before end of cycle tomorrow. To file a hold. Taylai's exhaled slowly. A continuity hold. You know what that does to your record. I know. She was quiet a moment, turning the fallen slate over in her hands without picking it back up, and Casen watched her make the same calculation Reyes had made 3 days ago, weighing whatever institutional loyalty she had left against whatever it was she'd been quietly not thinking about for a week. The registry desk closes to walk-in filings in 40 minutes, she said finally. After that it's appointment only, and appointments for procedures nobody's filed in living memory don't get scheduled fast. If you're going now, and I can get you past the concourse checkpoint without a credential flag, because I process passes through there 20 times a day, and nobody looks twice at me walking with a cadet carrying registry equipment. She bent and picked up the dropped slate, tucking it under her arm with the others, her voice dropping lower. I'm not doing this because I like you, Ward. I'm doing it because I read 411 annexation citations off founding-era precedent in my first year of training, and never once thought to ask what a discrepancy in the oldest one of them might mean. I'd like to stop not asking. The registry desk was a long counter of dark stone in a low-ceilinged chamber at the base of the court wing, staffed by a single elderly clerk who looked up at Casen's approach with the particular weariness of a man 40 minutes from the end of a shift, and unwilling to spend any of them on complications. Filing windows closing, the clerk said, before Casen had said a word. I need to file a continuity hold, Casen said. On first cycle material, catalog reference Kest Hollow Campaign Survey Log, currently scheduled for reduction within the next 18 hours. The clerk's expression didn't change, but his hands went still on the counter for just a moment before resuming their motion toward the appropriate console. Name and credential. Casen Ward, Tribute Cadet, Reduction Bay, personally handled the material under active reduction review. He set the transport case on the counter and opened it, laying the survey log flat where the clerk could see the binding, the title stamp, the stitched addendum pages folded at the back exactly where he'd found them. I've personally examined this material. It contains information materially relevant to active compact liability proceedings. The clerk looked at the document for a long moment, not with the boredom of a man processing routine paperwork, but with the slow, careful attention of someone who had, perhaps, worked this desk long enough to recognize when something rare was in front of him. Do you understand what filing this does? The clerk asked quietly, in a voice that had dropped the flat procedural register entirely. Your name goes on permanent record as the filer. This isn't reversible once it's logged. If the court finds the challenge without merit, there are professional consequences that follow a filer for the remainder of their tribute service, and likely beyond it. I understand. And you're certain? Casen thought of his mother's face freezing mid-sentence on a 90-second comms line. He thought of a cadet 8 years gone, reassigned 11 days after finding something nobody ever explained. He thought of Submarshal Illith Wren, dead 6 centuries, whose entire attempt to tell the truth had amounted to 4 pages nobody read, until a 19-year-old with an itch for thoroughness pulled a mislabeled crate off a reduction rack with 40 minutes left on its clock. I'm certain, he said. The clerk's hands moved across the console, slow and deliberate, entering the filing into a system that clearly hadn't processed one in longer than the man had worked the desk. A confirmation chime sounded, quiet and unremarkable, the kind of sound that meant nothing to anyone who didn't know what it had just done. Filed, the clerk said. As of this moment, this material is under formal court hold. Reduction authorization for the referenced catalog item is void, effective immediately, pending mandatory hearing. He looked up at Casen, and for just a moment something that might have been respect moved across his tired, careful face. The hearing will be scheduled within the court's discretion. Given the proximity to the compact renewal session already docketed for 9 days from now, and given that your filing explicitly ties this material to active compact liability, I expect, though I cannot guarantee, that the presiding adjudicator will elect to hear it jointly with that session, rather than separately. That would mean a public hearing. Broadcast per renewal session tradition. Casen felt something in his chest that wasn't quite relief, because relief implied the hardest part was over, and some quieter, steadier part of him already understood that it wasn't. But it was something. A door opened that Reyes had told him nobody dared open in living memory, and it had held. "What happens to the material now?" he asked. "It remains in court custody pending forensic authentication and the hearing itself," the clerk said, already reaching for a sealed storage case behind the counter, the kind built for exactly this, fragile evidence that a court needed intact and untampered until it could be examined under controlled conditions. You won't have access to it again before the hearing. Neither, for what it's worth, will anyone else outside authorized court personnel. He met Casen's eyes. That includes the Chief Registrar's office, cadet. As of this filing, this material is no longer his to reclassify. Word of the filing reached the reduction bay before Casen did. He returned to his dormitory block near midnight to find his own status flag glowing red on the block terminal, reassignment pending, conduct review escalated, and a summons, dated an hour earlier, requiring his presence at the Chief Registrar's office at the start of the next shift cycle. He went because not going would have been its own kind of confession, and because some hard, steady part of him wanted, after everything, to look Aldous Vren in the face at least once before the court did. Vren's office occupied the highest level of the Central Registry's administrative wing, walled in dark stone quarried from Ledger's Reach's own bedrock, shelved floor, to ceiling with physical volumes that Casen understood now, with a bitter clarity he hadn't possessed a week ago, were almost certainly there for the visual weight of scholarship rather than any daily use. Vren himself was an older Ashkarai, silver-scaled along the jaw the way the species aged, dressed in the unadorned dark robes of registry seniority, and he did not stand when Casen entered, only turned from the window with the flat, assessing patience of a man who had spent 25 years successfully making problems disappear, and saw no immediate reason to believe this one would prove different. "Cadet Ward," Vren's voice was measured, unhurried, entirely without heat. "You've had an eventful week." "I flagged a discrepancy. I followed procedure." "You filed a continuity hold against my office's classification decision, using a legal instrument so obscure I doubt 3 people currently serving in this registry could have located it in the statute without assistance." Vren's eyes, dark and unblinking, held Casen's without effort. "Which raises the question of who assisted you, and whether that person's career will survive the assistance. But we can set that aside. I'm more curious what you believe you've accomplished." "I've accomplished a hearing," Casen said, "in front of the court. With the material intact, because it's out of your reach now, whatever happens to me." Something moved behind Vren's expression, not alarm, not yet, but the first flicker of a man recalculating an equation he had believed settled for a quarter of a century. "You should understand something, cadet, before you invest too much hope in a single hearing. I wrote the standing transcription of that campaign report because I believed, and still believe, that it represents the historical record accurately. Whatever fragment you found stitched into an old binding is a disgruntled second officer's private grievance against a commanding officer, whose decision he disagreed with, not evidence, not testimony, not anything the continuity court will weigh against 6 centuries of settled law on the word of a tribute cadet with 11 months of registry experience." "Then you won't mind it being authenticated," Casen said, "in public, by the court's own forensic process, since you're so certain what it is. For just a moment, brief, controlled, almost invisible, something tightened at the corner of Vren's jaw. Then it smoothed away, and his voice returned to its measured, unhurried register, and he turned back toward the window as though the conversation had already concluded to his satisfaction. Your reassignment takes effect at the close of this hearing, regardless of its outcome, he said. Ledger's Reach has no further use for a reduction bay cadet who cannot be trusted with routine classification decisions. I'd suggest you use the next 9 days considering what you actually have, cadet, and not what you'd like to believe you have. Dismissed. Casen left without another word, because there was nothing left to say that the hearing wouldn't say better, and because he had, for the first time since he'd read the header on that 4th page, felt something steady settle into place beneath the fear. Vren hadn't asked what was in the addendum. Vren already knew, and a man that's certain of what a hearing would find generally didn't spend this much effort making sure the hearing never happened. The 9 days passed the way Rays had once described institutional time moving, slow in the middle, fast at both ends. Casen spent them confined to quarters under the conduct review, his terminal access stripped to nothing but the barest tribute cadet essentials, unable to reach Rays, unable to reach tail eyes, unable to do anything at all but wait and turn the shape of what he'd found over and over in his mind until it wore smooth from handling. He learned, on the 7th day, second-hand through a dormitory bulletin nobody had bothered to restrict, that Halden Rays's obstruction inquiry had quietly stalled, not dropped, not resolved, simply left open and unprosecuted, the particular limbo of a case someone senior had decided not to finish until they knew which way a larger matter was going to break. It wasn't freedom. But it wasn't the mining tribute posting Rays had warned him about either, and Casen understood, reading between the bulletin's flat administrative language, that somewhere above Vren's office, someone was waiting to see the hearing's outcome before deciding how hard to come down on the man who'd helped make it possible. On the 5th day, a message reached him through channels that shouldn't have been able to reach a conduct review cadet at all. No sender header, no routing origin, just a single unsigned line that appeared on his restricted terminal, and then, an hour later, quietly vanished from the log as though it had never been delivered. The registry is prepared to recommend early conclusion of your tribute service, with full compact credit applied to your family's outstanding debt, in exchange for a filed statement that your examination of the addendum was preliminary and inconclusive. This offer expires with the hearing. Casen read it 4 times before he understood what it actually was. Not a threat. A number. Somebody, Vren, or someone speaking for Vren, close enough to the Chief Registrar's authority to promise compact credit against a debt that had shaped his entire family's life, had done the arithmetic and decided that Casen Ward had a price, and that the price was the one thing his mother's whole existence had been built around wanting. He sat with it a long time. He thought about what early conclusion of tribute service would actually mean. His mother's shift schedule easing, maybe. Some real and immediate relief measured in hours she'd get back at the end of her life, rather than the abstract, generational promise of a court review that might take years to resolve anything at all. It was not a small thing being offered. It was, if he was honest with the small, frightened part of himself that hadn't stopped being 19 years old just because he'd read 4 pages nobody else had bothered to, close to everything he'd ever wanted for her. But asterisk inconclusive was a lie, and he understood, turning the offer over one more time in the dark of his restricted quarters, that it was built to be a lie that would hold. If he filed a statement calling his own examination preliminary, the addendum's authenticity would never be forensically tested at all. The hearing would have no reason to proceed past a filer's own recantation. The document would revert to registry custody the moment the hold lapsed, and there would be nothing left stopping Vren from finishing, quietly and at his leisure, what a reclassification notice had almost finished 9 days before. Submarshal Wren's 4 pages would go back into a crate. The next reduction window would not be 9 days away. It would not be delayed at all. He did not answer the message. There was no sender to answer, which he understood, the longer he sat with it, was itself the point, deniable, untraceable, offered and withdrawn without ever once putting Wren's own name where a continuity bar review could find it. He deleted it from his terminal, though he suspected it was already gone from anywhere that mattered, and did not tell Taylise or Reyes it had come at all, not because he thought either of them would judge him for having read it, but because some quiet, stubborn part of him needed, just once, to make this particular decision entirely alone. The hearing was scheduled for the morning of the 9th day, folded, exactly as the registry clerk had predicted, into the continuity court's already docketed compact renewal session for Earth, on the reasoning, stated plainly in the public docket notice, that a filed continuity hold asserting direct relevance to active compact liability could not, as a matter of procedural economy, be heard separately from the liability preceding it concerned. It would be broadcast. Every tribute world with standing interest in a compact renewal precedent kept a monitoring feed open for exactly this kind of session, which meant that whatever happened in the continuity court's main chamber this morning would be watched, in real time, by administrators and advocates and ordinary tribute workers across every occupied world bound into the Cordant Imperium's oldest debts, including Earth. Including, Casen understood with a tightness in his chest he hadn't expected, his mother, if she'd found a terminal and heard the docket notice in time, which the bulletin said had gone out to every Tribute World's public feed 3 days prior. In the last of the 9 days, working from the conservation wing under Reyes's borrowed clearance, Taylise had found one more thing, and she told Casen about it in the corridor outside the chamber with the particular controlled urgency of someone who had only just finished confirming it herself. Buried in a completely unrelated collection, decommissioned fleet maintenance ledgers, cataloged centuries ago under naval logistics rather than campaign history, the kind of material nobody cross-referenced against anything because nobody imagined it would matter. She had located the Reckoning's own post-campaign ordnance accounting, filed by the ship's quartermaster 3 weeks after Kest Hollow, showing a full spread of orbital bombardment munitions expended during the campaign's final 2 days. The official survey log claimed no ordnance had been used at all, since the population had, by Fleet Marshal Cade's account, already destroyed itself before the fleet ever engaged. A quartermaster with no reason to lie about supply counts had, without knowing it, left a second signature underneath Submarshal Wren's, 6 centuries apart, saying the same thing. It doesn't prove intent, Taylise said. It doesn't tell the court why Cade wrote what he wrote, but it corroborates timing and cause independently of the addendum itself, from a source that never had any reason to falsify a supply ledger. I think it matters. It matters, Casen agreed, and something in his chest loosened, fractionally, for the first time in 9 days. Not certainty that the hearing would go the way he needed it to, but the plainer, steadier relief of no longer standing alone on the strength of one document against a Chief Registrar's 40 years of institutional weight. Taylise Corps met him outside the chamber doors, in registry uniform, carrying a slate loaded with the 14-year-old reclassification log Casen had found buried in the audit archive. The one piece of evidence, beyond the document itself, that turned this from a scholarly disagreement into a documented pattern of deliberate concealment. I pulled the full audit trail, she said quietly, falling in step beside him as they approached the chamber. Not just the entry you found. Every routing decision Wren's office made on first cycle Kest Hollow material going back 30 years. There's a pattern, Ward. 3 separate instances before yours where a cadet or a junior registrar flagged something in that crate's vicinity, and every single time, the flag closed within days, reclassified, no review board, no record of what was found. You weren't the first person to notice. You're just the first one who didn't stop. What happened to the others? Reassigned, same as the one Ray's told you about. Taylai's jaw was tight. I found their names in the personnel logs. I don't know where any of them are now. The trail just ends. The chamber itself was larger than anything Casen had stood inside since arriving on Ledger's Reach. A wide, tiered amphitheater of dark stone, rising toward a domed ceiling inset with the Cordant Imperium's continuity seal. Benches for advocates and observers arranged in concentric rings around a raised central floor, where the presiding adjudicator's seat sat elevated above everything else in the room. Broadcast pickups, small and unobtrusive, ringed the upper gallery. Casen had never in his life been watched by this many people, and the feeling of it settled into his stomach like cold water the moment he took the witness bench reserved for the filer of record. Corvin Thessaly entered a few minutes later, elderly even by Ashkarai standard, silver gone nearly white along the jaw, moving with the unhurried gravity of someone who had presided over this chamber long enough to have lost any illusion that certainty came easily. The adjudicator settled into the raised seat, surveyed the chamber once, and opened the session with a voice that carried without effort to every corner of the room. "This court convenes today in joint session," Thessaly said, "to consider the compact renewal of Earth's tribute status, understanding continuity of claim liability, and pursuant to a continuity hold filed 9 days ago by Registry Cadet Casen Ward, to review a challenge to the historical basis of that liability's controlling precedent. The court will hear the challenge first, as its outcome may bear directly on the renewal proceeding it accompanies." Aldous Vren sat at the advocate's bench opposite Casen's, in formal registry robes, flanked by 2 junior counsel Casen didn't recognize, his expression composed into the same unhurried patience it had worn in his office 9 days earlier. He did not look at Casen. He looked instead at the adjudicator, with the settled confidence of a man who had faced this chamber before and never once lost. "Cadet Ward," Thessaly said, "you filed this hold on the basis of material you discovered during reduction bay duty. State, for the record, what that material is and why you believe it bears on this court's standing precedent." Casen stood. His voice, when it came, was steadier than he expected, the flat, careful register he'd spent 11 months practicing over a scanner console, the register that made a discrepancy report legible instead of frightened. The original physical survey log of the Kest Hollow campaign, filed by Fleet Marshal Orson Cade 600 years ago, and cited by this court as the foundational precedent for the Cinder Doctrine ever since. I found it mislabeled as a duplicate in a reduction bay crate, scheduled for destruction. When I examined it, I found that it contains 4 pages the standing transcription does not, an addendum filed by Submarshal Illith Wren, the Reckoning's second officer, contradicting Fleet Marshal Cade's account of what happened at Kest Hollow. Submarshal Wren's addendum states that long-range scans showed the settlement evacuating in the days before planetfall, and that the Ashfield's Fleet Marshal Cade's report attributes to self-destruction match the signature of the Reckoning's own bombardment. If the addendum is accurate, Kest Hollow did not choose the Cinder vow. It was destroyed while attempting to leave. A ripple moved through the gallery, not loud but unmistakable, the particular sound of a great many people understanding, at the same moment, exactly what was being said. "You did not report this discrepancy directly to the Chief Registrar's office upon discovery," Thessaly said, before turning to Vren at all. Standing procedure for a first-cycle anomaly of this significance would ordinarily route immediately to senior review. Explain that decision. Casen had known this question would come, and had spent 9 days deciding how honestly to answer it. Standing procedure requires an anomaly flag to route through the discrepancy system, presiding adjudicator, which I filed correctly and immediately. What I did not do was contact the Chief Registrar's office personally, or discuss my findings with anyone outside proper channels, before that flag reached his desk through ordinary process. I want to be plain about why. Registrar Vren's name appears on the canonical transcription of this exact report. I did not know at the time whether that meant he had simply never seen the addendum or whether he had. I chose to let the standard process answer that question rather than answering it for myself. It answered it within 8 days, when the item was reclassified and returned to the reduction schedule without ever reaching a review board. You are suggesting the ordinary process itself constituted evidence. I'm saying it was the only test available to a cadet with no authority to demand anything more direct, presiding adjudicator. I used what I had. Thessaly studied him a moment longer, something unreadable moving behind the adjudicator's ancient, patient eyes, and then inclined their head once, a small motion that might have been the closest thing to approval the chamber would see all morning. That is a fair answer, Registrar Vren, your response to the substance of the allegation. Vren rose, smooth and unruffled. Presiding adjudicator, the court has heard a compelling story from a cadet with no formal training in historical authentication, describing 4 pages he claims exist in a document he alone has handled. I would ask the court to consider what is actually being offered here. An uncorroborated fragment, in a hand no living scholar has verified, brought forward by an individual whose own conduct record shows a pattern of insubordination toward proper registry classification procedure. 6 centuries of legal precedent, cited in 411 subsequent proceedings, ought not be set aside on the unverified word of a tribute laborer. The document is in the court's custody, Thessaly said. Not the cadet's word alone. I assume the registry's forensic examiners have had opportunity to assess it since the filing. They have not, said the registry clerk who had processed Casen's filing 9 days earlier, rising from a side bench Casen hadn't noticed him occupying. Per standing evidentiary protocol, forensic authentication of contested first cycle material is withheld until the hearing itself, to prevent any party from influencing the examiner's findings beforehand. The document has remained under sealed court custody since the filing. I can attest to that personally. Then let it be examined now, Thessaly said, in this chamber before this court and this broadcast, so that no question remains afterward about whether the finding was made freely. The forensic examination took the better part of an hour, and Casen sat through every minute of it with his hands flat on his knees, forcing himself still, while a team of court-appointed archivists, Ashkarai, all of them, none affiliated with the Central Registry, drawn instead from an independent conservation institute whose neutrality Thessaly stated plainly for the broadcast record, worked with careful, unhurried instruments over the document laid open on a viewing table at the chamber's center. They tested the vellum's fiber composition against known first-cycle material standards. They dated the ink through isotopic decay signatures too fine for the naked eye to distinguish, comparing the addendum's ink against the report's main body, against known reference samples from the correct 600-year period, against the Vren transcription's own printing stock for contrast. They examined the binding thread, the stitching pattern at the rear gathering, the handwriting itself against surviving fleet correspondence from the same campaign period held elsewhere in the Central Registry's collection. Correspondence, the lead examiner noted for the record, that had never been cross-referenced against the Kest Hollow report before, because no prior scholar had ever had reason to suspect the report contained anything requiring the comparison. The vellum and ink of the 4 addendum pages, the lead examiner said finally, addressing the chamber directly, her voice carrying the flat, unadorned certainty of someone reporting a measurement rather than an opinion, date to within the same generation as the report's main body. The binding thread is contemporaneous with the original gathering, not a later addition. The handwriting matches, with a confidence interval the court will find in our full report, surviving correspondence independently attributed to Submarshal Ilith Wren, second officer of the survey vessel reckoning, during the relevant campaign period. This is not a later forgery and not a modern fabrication. It is, in the court's own forensic judgment, an authentic period document. The chamber went very quiet. Chain of custody, Thessaly said. Cadet Ward discovered this document 11 days ago. Prior to that, where has it been? The registry clerk answered again. Digitization and custody logs place this exact catalog item in sealed first cycle storage continuously for the last 231 years, per unbroken automated record, with only 2 access events during that span. Both routine inventory audits, the first roughly 200 years ago, the second 14 years ago, conducted by then Junior Registrar Aldous Vren. Every eye in the chamber turned toward the advocate's bench. Vren's composure did not break, not visibly, but something in the set of his shoulders had gone very still. Taylai's core stood from the observer's gallery, slate raised, and Thessaly, after a moment's consideration, gestured for her to approach. Presiding adjudicator, I hold the full reclassification audit trail for this catalog item, compiled from the Central Registry's own internal records. During the 14-year-old access event referenced by the clerk, Registrar Vren personally reclassified this item from first cycle protected status to second cycle confirmed duplicate, with the notation duplicate confirmed, no addendum, a notation that could only be accurate if the addendum did not exist at the time of his review, or if he had chosen not to disclose it. The Vren transcription, the standing canonical text this court has cited in 411 proceedings, was completed 11 years prior to that access event. There was no reason for Registrar Vren to review this item at all in a routine audit, unless he already had cause to suspect it required special handling. There is also independent corroboration of the addendum substance, Taylai added, before Vren could press further, laying a second slate beside the first. The survey vessel reckoning's own post-campaign ordnance accounting, filed by its quartermaster 3 weeks after the campaign concluded, records a full spread of orbital bombardment munitions expended in the final 2 days at Kest Hollow. Munitions, the standing survey log claims, were never used, on the premise that the population had already destroyed itself before the fleet engaged. This ledger was filed independently of Submarshal Wren, by an officer with no apparent stake in the campaign's political narrative, and it has sat uncross-referenced in naval logistics storage for 600 years, because no prior review ever thought to connect it to this proceeding. That is a characterization of my professional judgment, not evidence of concealment, Vren said, his voice tighter now, the unhurried patience finally showing the first hairline cracks. A junior registrar reviewing an old crate and making a classification error is not a crime, presiding adjudicator. It is an error. Errors happen across 6 centuries of registry work. One error, Thessaly said, in isolation might be. Registrar Corps, is this the only instance in the audit trail of anomalous handling around this specific catalog item? No, presiding adjudicator. 3 prior instances, spanning 30 years, show junior staff flagging discrepancies in the vicinity of this item's storage record, each closed within days without formal review, each followed within a month by the flagging staff member's reassignment away from the central registry. Taylai's voice did not waver. I have the personnel records. I have not been able to locate any of the 3 individuals in current registry service anywhere in the Imperium. The silence that followed lasted long enough that Casen could hear, faintly, the low electronic hum of the broadcast pickups ringing the gallery above them, carrying every second of it outward to 1,000 monitoring feeds across 1,000 tribute worlds. Thessaly did not rule quickly. The adjudicator sat for a long moment with hands folded, gaze moving once across the chamber, the sealed document on its viewing table, the forensic examiners standing by their findings, Vren motionless at the advocate's bench, Casen still on the filer's bench with his hands flat on his knees. "This court does not overturn 6 centuries of settled precedent lightly," Thessaly said finally, "and I will not pretend today's finding does that. What today's finding establishes is narrower, and in its way more serious, that the foundational report underlying the Cinder Doctrine was, at minimum, materially incomplete for its entire existence as controlling precedent, that a contradictory contemporaneous account existed and was suppressed, and that registry leadership was aware of that contradiction for at least 14 years and took deliberate action to prevent its disclosure." Vren opened his mouth to speak. Thessaly did not look at him, and the adjudicator's next words moved past him entirely, addressed instead to the full chamber and the feeds beyond it. "The Cinder Doctrine, as this court has applied it, is hereby referred to the full continuity bench for comprehensive review, with all 411 citing proceedings flagged for re-examination as that review proceeds. This will not be swift. It will not, I suspect, be simple, but it will happen, on the record, under public review, rather than continuing to rest on a report this court now knows to have been deliberately incomplete." The adjudicator paused. "As to the matter this challenge accompanies, Earth's compact renewal, presently before this court under continuity of claim liability tracing, in significant part, to annexation law built on the doctrine now under review, this court cannot in good conscience renew that liability's terms today as though today's finding did not occur. Earth's compact renewal is stayed, pending the outcome of the Cinder Doctrine review, with existing tribute terms frozen at current levels rather than escalated, and with standing instruction that the review's outcome be applied retroactively to Earth's liability determination once concluded." It was not everything. Casen understood that, sitting very still on the filer's bench while the words settled into the chamber around him. It was not Earth walking free of the debt, not today, not in one session, not with a single ruling from a court that had built 6 centuries of institutional weight on the doctrine it had just agreed to review. But it was a stay, a freeze. The first crack in 40 years, in a liability everyone had told his mother was simply the shape of the world, unchangeable, inherited, permanent. "As to Chief Registrar Aldous Vren," Thessaly continued, and now the adjudicator did look at him, directly, without heat but without any softness either, "this court finds sufficient evidence of deliberate suppression of material historical record, and of retaliatory action against registry staff who discovered it, to refer the matter to the continuity bar for formal misconduct proceedings, with immediate suspension of registrar authority pending that review." Vren did not answer. He stood very still at the advocate's bench, 25 years of composure finally, visibly, gone, and said nothing at all as 2 court attendants approached to escort him from the chamber. The obstruction inquiry against Halden Reyes closed within the week, charges withdrawn. A man could not be prosecuted for obstructing the concealment of a documented crime. The closing notice observed dryly, in language Casen suspected some clerk had taken quiet pleasure in drafting. Reyes was reinstated to registry service, though not to his old post. The reduction bay, in the review's aftermath, was undergoing what the notice called a full procedural audit, and Reyes had been reassigned, for the duration of it, to the Central Registry's Conservation Wing. A demotion in visibility if not quite in rank, the specific, ordinary unfairness of an institution correcting a wrong without ever quite making the person who'd helped expose it whole again. Casen found him there, a week after the hearing, in a long quiet hall of climate-controlled storage racks, cataloging conservation priorities for material the registry had, for the first time in living memory, decided was worth the expense of protecting rather than reducing. "They offered me a formal apprenticeship," Casen said, setting a data slate down on Reyes's work table. "Registrar apprentice, conservation track, not cadet status anymore." "Good," Reyes said, not looking up from the tray of fragile pages in front of him. "You've earned better than a scanner console." You could have let the sweep find it. You could have stayed out of all of it. Reyes finally looked up, and something in his tired, careful face had shifted since the last time Casen had seen it. Some weight settled differently than before. I told you once that nobody wins against an institution by being right. I still believe that mostly. But I also told you the only way you win at all is by making being right cost the institution more than silencing you does. He gestured at the racks around them, at the conservation wing that had not existed with this budget or this staff 2 weeks ago. This is what it costs them now, Ward. Not everything. Not the whole doctrine, not overnight, but something. That's not nothing. Casen thought of the reduction clock that used to hang over his old station, counting down toward destruction, with the same flat indifference it had shown every crate before this one. He thought of Submarshal Illith Wren, dead 6 centuries, whose only act of resistance had been 4 careful pages nobody read for 600 years, not because the truth was hidden well, but because nobody with the patience to find it had ever been given a reason strong enough to look. Taileyes found him there before he left the conservation wing, still in registry uniform. A new insignia at her collar that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago, reassigned herself. She told him, out of routing and into the continuity bar's own investigative staff, tracking down what had happened to 3 names in a personnel file that ended without explanation. There are others, she said. Other doctrines built the same way, probably. Nobody's looked, because nobody had a reason strong enough to keep looking once the first flag closed. I intend to keep looking anyway. Vren's not going to be the only one, Casen said. It wasn't a question. No, he's just the one we caught first. She studied him a moment, something almost like a smile at the corner of her mouth. For what it's worth, cadet, apprentice now, I checked the monitoring numbers on the broadcast feed after the ruling. Every tribute world with a standing interest logged in, including Earth, including, I'd guess, whoever you were hoping might be watching. He hadn't let himself think about that too directly, in the days since, whether his mother had found a terminal in time, whether she'd understood, watching a hearing 400 light-years away, that the boy asking careful procedural questions on the filer's bench was the same one who used to freeze on a 90-second comms line every 10th day. He would know for certain in 3 days, when his monthly minutes reset, and he could call her properly and hear it in her voice instead of guessing at it from a stranger's monitoring report. For now it was enough to imagine it. An entire debt shift crew somewhere on a planet he hadn't seen in 2 years, gathered around one working screen, watching an unremarkable 19-year-old in gray coveralls tell a court exactly what he'd found and refuse calmly to make it sound bigger than it was. He picked the transport case up off Reyes' work table. Empty now, the survey log itself remaining in the continuity court's permanent evidentiary archive, no longer anyone's to reduce or reclassify or bury again, and set it back on its shelf among 100 others just like it, ordinary and unremarkable, indistinguishable from every case that had never once held anything the Cordant Imperium didn't want found. Somewhere back on Earth, 400 light-years away, his mother's debt shift would run 1 increment shorter this cycle than it had run every cycle before it. It wasn't freedom. It was a beginning, the first one anyone had managed to open in 40 years, sitting where it had always been, in 4 careful pages that everyone before him had ignored, and that he alone had bothered to read all the way to the end. Reyes walked him as far as the conservation wing's main doors, the 2 of them silent for most of it, until the older man stopped at the threshold and said, in the same flat, unhurried voice he'd used to teach a scanner console's proper handling 11 months earlier, "You'll want to remember, apprentice, that this doesn't end tonight. The bar review will take years. The doctrine review longer than that. 411 proceedings don't get reopened in a season." "I know." "Do you?" Reyes almost smiled. "Good, then you already understand the job. Someone has to keep reading the appendices nobody else bothers with for as long as it takes." He nodded once, toward the racks of newly protected material behind them, toward the whole slow, patient weight of the work still ahead. Go home tonight, Ward. Sleep. Tomorrow the crates are still going to be there, and so, this time, will you? Casen went. Behind him, the conservation wing's lights dimmed to their night cycle one rack at a time, and the last thing to go dark was the shelf, where an empty transport case sat among 100 identical others, waiting, the way everything on Ledger's reach eventually waited, for someone patient enough to open it and actually look.